Alright, in part 3 I just wanted to quickly go over a few things I missed in the last video and explore a little bit around the graph paper used in the 340 cipher at least, and maybe some clues from drafting we can discover in that. So here's the general notes that I wanted to put up, which as you can see is full of this use of the word shall. It's used in a prescriptive way in construction and drawing notes. There's quite a lot about compliance and regulations in here as well, and responsibilities. And the same sort of thing is found in planning documents, such as this one, that again is prescribing the elements of development control. Here's some more examples where we can see the use of shall, again relating to standards and permits and that sort of thing. And we can see that in some hand drawing notes over here. And what's interesting about some of these hand drawing notes as well, which I'll go through later in the graph paper, is just all the guidelines that have been drawn here in pencil. Reviews them usually drawn in pencil and then rubbed out, or they're drawn in a blue pencil that doesn't print as well. And in some of these old drawings that I found, it's great because the copiers pick all of that sort of detail up. You'll also notice that there's quite often, this one's a little bit more even. You can see from the guidelines over here, the pencil line work. But this one up here, you can see that there's a wider spacing for the letters, and then there's a smaller spacing for the gaps in between those letters. Now, I also just want to return to the bus bomb diagrams just to mention something I missed last time, which was really around the layout of the page in terms of its scale. Clearly, it's going between an abstract scale of uniform here, while it's showing the road environment. This is not quite aligning up with the photo electric sensor and torch or flash bulb over here. It's assumed that that's up on an embankment or something, because I don't think he mentions anything about light poles or trees or whatever, but he confirms that at least in the second bus bomb diagram where he shows a slope. Now, in and itself, that's kind of unusual because we can see here he's got the bus going the same way on the side of the road, yet there's nothing on this side of the road that insinuates an embankment. We don't know if that drops off down a hillside, and the same with this one here. We don't know what's happening on both sides of the road. So my suspicion is Zodiac actually doesn't have a site at all. He hasn't worked that out. He's bouncing between two different section profiles in that. And then again, coming back to these bombs, so I went through last time and showed that he did demonstrate some nice use of open connections from electrical circuits. That's really electronic circuits. So, does that mean that down the bottom here of the slope where he's got his bags of bombs, and we assume that they're somewhere around here because you're going to have your shoulder and drainage and utilities trenches. You don't want this thing flooded. He shows it up high here in the second bus bomb diagram, so we can assume that it's up high as well in the first one, but it's further down the slope or down from whatever he was trying to show with this floating tube down the bottom of the slope. But you're going from an electronic circuit to bags of bombs. I mean, there's probably far easier ways if you're cabling all the way up the slope or all the way back to the rest of the contraption. That, what has he got? A little circuit in a box that then feeds the bombs. There's a disconnect in terms of what he's actually trying to articulate here in terms of the bomb. And then again, we assume that the torch, the photoelectric sensor, and the battery and the timer are all together, housed somewhere you know, in this environment, wherever it is. I mean, are they hidden in bushes? Is this in a box somewhere that's camouflaged? The mirror on the other side of the road. I mean, as I said in my last video, this is ridiculous. I mean, he's clever in the way that he's laid out all these pages and demonstrates good drafting and drawing ability. He's got a nice touch. You know, when you look closely at those cars, there's a bit of artistic touch to those. I don't think that's the first time he's drawn cars in the section. And, you know, but when it comes to the actual bomb and figuring out the logistics, I think he's immature. And that's kind of what I was meaning in my last video by this ambiguity between maturity and immaturity in understanding what's going to happen. That, you know, I think a lot of people have pointed out, like, what if a truck comes by, a removalist truck? You know, it's even smaller things like, what if the mirror is shifted? What if the torch battery runs out? Why does the clock need the year-long battery? What if it rains for a week and all of this gets wet? You know, he talks about this thing getting wet in his basement and turning into a dud. How is it going to survive in this environment? You know, next to a swale. And, you know, in the second bus bomb diagram, he's done a bit better with the switch. He's got that a little bit more accurate towards what we'd see in certain textbooks and electronics manuals. But still, I kind of wonder, surely there's an easy way to do this, like a photographic timer or some other timer that automates the connection without having to actually show it as this mechanical movement of an arm of a timer then forming the connection. That's just incredibly risky. And the same with the first bus bomb diagram, this idea of 4 points latching onto the 4 points here. Yeah, again, in a electronics circuit board diagram, it kind of works, but in the practical nature of being on a clock face or wristwatch or whatever it is, no, I don't think it's going to work. So I think he was having a bit of fun with these diagrams. I think he was just taking the mickey out of the police, and I think he alluded to that in later communications with police, that, you know, he kind of had a go at them, like, surely you didn't think I was serious. And I don't think he was. Now, having a look at the graph paper of some of the ciphers. Now, this is the 340 cipher. I haven't looked at 408. And I found this reference grid, which was cool. I can't remember who posted it, but thank you to whoever did. It was interesting that it looks like it's been hand drawn itself. And so I grabbed some graph paper and got a similar scaled grid. Now, this was supposed to be based off 1.5 inch, and that's what I've got here, except it's into 1/5 of an inch segments to make it divisible by 10 across a lot of the cells. And we can see that that lines up perfectly for the grid. There are some problems though. The first is that the scale is wrong. Now, I'm not sure if this was drawn with graph paper or just drawn over the top of the cipher, basically matching the scale of the cipher rather than matching the scale of the photograph from law enforcement. But if we take this scale to be true, then we can see that the Zodiac is out. And my gut feeling for that is, whichever graph paper or however he's gridded up the backing of this cipher, I think he's used a photocopier to reduce its scale so that it fits onto the page or the letter format that he's using, which I think is executive, because that's American 7 1/4, 10 1/2 inches. So he might have done the original draft to scaled graph paper, but then I think he's photocopied it to be smaller and then gone over that smaller copy to do his final print or final draft in felt tip pen to send on. Now, the other thing with the 1/5 grid that's kind of interesting, that is worth noting, that in between the letters, it's generally, there's a little bit of roughness where he goes outside of lines. He's not absolutely perfectly neat, but it's generally 2/5 of an inch or 2 cells, and then the letters themselves are usually 3, and this works both up and down. And that could also mean that he's either manipulated the graph paper up or down, left and right, so that he gets a nice even line of the graph paper, and then he can start to utilize that 2:3 ratio that we have. Or he may have even drawn up his own guidelines in pencil and not use graph paper, but actually drawn up his own grid to work with it. When we look at the 1/2 inch grid or 1/5 microgrid, we can see that the Zodiac crosshairs don't really line up with the 4 and the 8s. There's the extra column to make it 17, and then we can see that it also doesn't align with these little minus buttons, and that will be something to consider as we move forward. Now, a much more ideal graph paper size would be 1/4 inch, and as we can see, I've overlaid the 1/4 inch over the 340 cipher, and it immediately becomes apparent how easy it would be for him to draw in each letter, whether he's going horizontally or vertically. And that's how a lot of drafters would use graph paper, or would utilize guidelines to create their even text. In comparison, if we were to look at doing it by drawing in the letters and the symbols within these boxes, there has to be a lot more attention to being neat, both vertically and horizontally. And I just think it makes far more sense that he's utilized 1/4 inch grid. That seems to make the most sense, and when it fits in. Now, my paper that I've got here only goes to 16 columns, but Zodiac could have had a graph paper dimension that was spreading out the whole way across his drawing board. He could have had a larger paper size of graph paper. Anything's possible with that, but I've just had to work within what I just got off the internet. And even if Zodiac was using, say, a smaller graph paper or graph paper notepad, for example, and he only had the 16 columns, he could easily put in the last column. Anyway, that's micro detail, irrelevant. The 1/4 inch seems to work really well. Now, again, the scale's incorrect because, as I said before, no matter how he did this, I think he's reduced it on a photocopier to do the final draft. So this is not to scale, but the original was probably done to the true scale, which is just slightly larger. Now, the other thing about using the 1/4 inch grid is it puts the center line for Zodiac's crosshairs bang center of that geometry, and also bang center of the middle minus symbols, which I don't know if there's any meaning to that, but I just thought that's pretty interesting. Now we can see here with some landscape documentation, this grid lines being used. So there's a lot of effort that's put into just doing a simple schedule and detail like this, you can again see there is sometimes some evidence of slightly different ratio between how much room is allowed for text and how much is allowed for the gaps in between the text. It varies between documentation and the formality and which drafter is doing what, but you can see here that these pencil marks have gone through from the detail into the schedule, and while the symbols in the schedule are larger, filling up the whole box, we can see that there's different guidelines that have been used to fit this text in. And here again we can see some more examples of that, where we have the slightly larger dimension for the writing, and then we have a thinner dimension for the gap in between. And you can just see, you know, all these drawings have had set out guidelines to help in the construction and keep things neat, and it appears that the Zodiac has a similar sort of thing. But I think at the ciphers, whether he did his own grid, I think it's probably far more likely and easier just to use the graph paper like the 1/4 inch. Now, if we try as a wildcard metric, let's say, for example, Zodiac got his hands on some metric graph paper and used that as some kind of trick thing. Well, first of all, because the scale's incorrect on Zodiac, he's reduced the scale. Therefore, it basically turns out the same as the 1/4 inch as we have over here in the reference drawing. It's just literally a square grid that fits into the dimension of what Zodiac used. If we try centimeters at true scale, so based off the law enforcement scale, and we convert that to centimeters, unfortunately we don't get any surprises. The things don't quite line up and they start getting a bit gnarly in places, although it's reasonably close in other areas. Either way, my thoughts are that Zodiac used a grid more like this rather than the letters being floating in the middle of a box. I think he's got a much tighter grid that explains how all this is done. That's also going to be far more useful in how he arranges the cipher key and his transpositions. Now, whether he used his own grid and made it to a scale that fits the letter, whether he did his own grid and then photocopied and reduced the size, or whether he used graph paper like 1/4 inch and then reduced it on the photocopier, I think that's sort of how he did the 340 cipher, at least. Now, one or two other things I wanted to mention about the Halloween card. When I was talking about the geometry here before, I was measuring this pen and ink one that was in the top left-hand corner of one of the cards, and that's at 30, and this was slightly off and slightly off. They may have, Zodiac may have been attempting to do these at 45. It's just that the drawing is so small. He might have drawn that in at 30. In the white version in the card that's painted on, it appears to be more like 45-degree angle, so just wanted to mention that. Otherwise, everything else lines up very cleanly with the 90 degrees, which of course is 60, 30, double 45, and then the 45 down here. And the dots form, of course, the famous Freemasonry symbol, is essentially based around sacred geometry, and the history of all this Freemasonry in some ways is discrete, but is also in alignment with drafting, architecture, engineering. So the mathematics that we see in some ways is very basic. It's the Pythagoras and trigonometry. There's also the clue-ins to radians and the mathematics behind that. And we can even see some of those zigzag types of patterns coming through in Zodiac's communications, including his cipher structure, and even maybe the grey seeing eyelashes of the Halloween card. But this geometry is also kind of the root and the basic equipment of drafting. The compass and the set square, the protractor and the set square. It's used in so many things, from land management through time and architecture through history. So much of ancient architecture and design is really clearly geometric. Modern day architecture has a lot more of an organic vocabulary and syntax, but we can see that while there might be a lot of esoteric elements to Zodiac, I don't know how much he really goes into truly linking things like Freemasonry. It may be there, but this easier solution, given that we know that he's drafting with the 30 and 60 degree set square and the 45 degree triangular set square, we know he has this equipment which is basic drafting equipment. And of course the compass, used a lot in land survey and landscape architecture. And then we have the geometry coming through in the Zodiac symbol in multiple ways, either divisions of the halves or with the thirds like a clock. And then we can also see here the old technical drawing book drawings, except this is actually not from technical drawing. I actually found this and wanted to put this in. It's from an earlier technical drawing book, I think called Engineering Technical Drawing, that was from about 1910. Has the identical sketches as Frederick Gassaic Technical Drawing, which had those circular arrows with that fletching. This diagram doesn't have that same arrow fletching or anything like that, but the diagrams and the rest of the book is fairly similar. So that's just going back in early technical drawing books, but actually as we go back in time, we can see that this geometry is consistent both in ancient architecture and design and engineering, but also nature. So it's just really interesting. This can be taken as far as you want it to go, but I think it's just really interesting that at the very least Zodiac is showing off or utilizing that he has this equipment and it's in his communications.